Welcome to the Sense of Direction and the Cognitive Map, a symposium in honor of Jim Ranck. And welcome to the State University of New York Global Center here in Manhattan. My name is Mark Stewart. I'm a scientific descendant of Jim's, and I'll say a little bit about that. But I think I got the opportunity to stand up here and introduce today and welcome you because I'm one of the sponsors of this event. But most importantly for me, I've had the great opportunity to be a graduate student with Stephen Fox, who was Jim Ranck's graduate student, and been part of the laboratory at a time in the late 1980s, middle and late 1980s, with John Kuby and Bob Muller, and some trainees who were at or above my level, people like Greg Quirk, Jeff Taube, Elizabeth Bostock, and Pat Sharp. It was really quite an extraordinary time at Downstate, and for me, scientifically. For those of you, you've got your own groups of hippocampal physiologists and anatomists. Most of you know that group of people that I talked about, and so you have a full understanding of how dysfunctional a family that was, with Jim as the head of the household, but a family it was. My job initially here is to give a bit of background on Jim, and so first on my list of things to do is to go through some of the drier history, things that come from a volume like this, which we did at Downstate a couple of years back, short biographies on the 150 all-stars at Downstate over its first 150 years of history, and Jim was profiled in that book. So some of my information I took from there, and the rest, of course, from Wikipedia, because this is an area that I don't know much about for Jim. But Jim was born 86 years ago in Frederick, Maryland, attended Haverford College, graduating in 1951, Columbia University School of Medicine, graduating in 1955, did a year internship at the University of Chicago, a stint at the NIH in the Laboratory of Neuroanatomy, and did a postdoc after that at the University of Washington with Walter Woodbury. And from there took his first faculty position at the University of Michigan in 1962. From 62 to 65, to 1975 rather, Jim was at Michigan, and we saw him at Downstate in 1975 as a professor of physiology, where he started actually developing a fairly significant group of hippocampal physiologists and neurobiologists. In 2005, the State University of New York recognized Jim for his many years of service to the university with the title of Distinguished Teaching Professor. Jim has a way of, many of you who know Jim, know that Jim has a way of describing things with a color depth that's richer than most, and sometimes in talking to Jim, you get more color than depth. And as one example, as a graduate student, I underperformed in Jim's eyes on a comprehensive exam question that I was given where I needed to describe the differences between hippocampal and parietal cortical roles in spatial perception. And so my penance was to spend additional time with Jim, where he spent the time explaining to me how Hans Teubert died tragically off the British Virgin Islands in a swimming accident. That was the whole session that I had with Jim. So my understanding of parietal and hippocampal control of spatial perception is not much better than it was 30 years ago. But I've had the great good fortune of interacting with a number of you here and learning from the extraordinary discoveries made by this group. One little additional story, or two other stories that I'll just mention because they've shaped some of how I've taken my own research in a direction. When I first was a student at Downstate, I went to Jim to explore a research project with Jim, and Jim put me onto John Kuby, and John and I spent some time developing a room-sized chamber within which we could test whether rats would be able to discriminate a compass direction versus local cues. And anybody who knows me knows that I'm not terribly good with behaving animals. And I made things worse by using a chamber that would intentionally disorient the animals when we brought them into the testing area. And so I would put them into this chamber from their home cage and spin them around and reach in to take them out. And every time I would be bitten. And when rats bite, they bite to the bone. And so on a day when I had 7 bandages on 7 different fingers, I met Steve Fox and was watching what he was doing. And his rats were just sitting there very calmly. And I asked, how was that possible? And he said, urethane. And I said, this is awesome. So that started my partnership with Steve Fox and my love for the anesthetic urethane, which we've used in the years since. It saved me from having to get any better with behavior. A more recent story is one that was good fun, involving Bob Muller more than Jim Ranck. In one of Bob's journal clubs, he was discussing one of Michael Hasselmo's papers, original papers, talking about cholinergic modulation of synaptic transmission in hippocampus and the importance of that modulation for shaping the signals that CA1 pyramidal cells would display as place cell firing. And a major part of that story was that acetylcholine would depress the synaptic input from area CA3 to area CA1 and intensify, or relatively intensify, the synaptic input from entorhinal cortex. And the paper described how important that was in place cell firing. And I had been doing some slice work and explained to Bob that acetylcholine also depresses the CA1 projection to subiculum just as strongly. And so as interesting as all of this place cell calculation was, the signal didn't go anywhere. So it was actually just an inside joke for area CA1. It would calculate this stuff but never share the information with any other part of brain. At that point, Muller said, get out of the journal club and don't ever come back. So, which was okay with me. So anyway, throughout this day, I'm sure you're going to get a heavy dose of reminiscences from people. You'll get some cutting-edge science from them. This is a group that's really changed neuroscience in a number of ways. Sadly for me, in my role as dean of the graduate school, I don't see this kind of colorful interaction in lots of institutions anymore. This is really a group that drove neuroscience forward in a way that was very exciting for me as a student and for other people that I know as students. And we constantly look for ways to cultivate this kind of collegiality and exciting exploration of different areas in not just neuroscience, but anything. But this was really a very good experience for me to have been at least on the sidelines watching some of the extraordinary work done by this group. So my understanding is that Jim is on his way and should be here in less than an hour, but we're going to move ahead and we'll interrupt things when he finally gets here because New York City traffic can be unpredictable, and even though his ETA is an hour, that could turn into 4 hours. So